Imagine flying over a black expanse of water where the horizon doesn't exist. Above you, the stars are bright, but below there is only a deep, hungry void. You are 20 years old, and for the first time in your life, you feel like you finally own the sky. Then you look up through the glass of your cockpit and realize you aren't alone anymore. The radio crackles with a sound that shouldn't be possible in the vacuum of high altitude. It is a rhythmic metallic grinding, like a giant serrated blade being dragged across a steel hull. Back on the ground, the man listening to your voice realizes he is hearing the sound of someone being taken. This is the last thing Frederick Valentich ever felt. Hey everyone, I'm glad you could make it back. It's good to just sit down and talk through these things together. We have 11 stories to get through in this episode, all from a very strange window of time in the late 1970s. If you're enjoying these deeper dives into the unexplained, please do subscribe or leave a comment about where you're listening from. It's always interesting to see who is out there in the dark with us. I saw a comment the other day from someone listening while working a night shift at a shipyard, which feels appropriately eerie for today. If you could tap that like button, it really helps the show find more people who appreciate the strange. Now let's get back to the cockpit of that Cessna over the Bay Strait. On the evening of October 21st, 1978, at a small airfield called Moorabbin, just south of Melbourne, Australia, Frederick Valentich was preparing for a routine training flight. Frederick was 20 years old, and if you saw him walking across the tarmac, you would see a young man who looked exactly like what he was, a student of the sky. He wasn't a reckless kid. He didn't drink, he didn't stay out late, and he didn't have much of a social life outside of the aviation community. His father, Guido Valentich, would later describe him as a boy who lived and breathed flight manuals. Frederick's bedroom was filled with posters of vintage Spitfires and technical diagrams of engine components. He wanted to be a commercial pilot more than anything. That night, Frederick was flying a Cessna 18-2. It's a reliable 4-seat light aircraft that pilots often call the workhorse of the sky. He had about 150 hours of flight time under his belt, which is a respectable amount for a student, but it's also that dangerous window where a pilot starts to feel comfortable enough to relax their guard. He was headed for King Island, a small piece of land sitting in the middle of the Bay Strait. The flight was supposed to take about an hour and 15 minutes. The weather was perfect. There was no wind to speak of. The visibility was 10 miles plus, and the sky was a deep velvet blue. Frederick checked his fuel, adjusted his headset, and taxied out to the runway. For the first 45 minutes, the flight was completely unremarkable. Frederick maintained a steady altitude of 4,500 feet. To his left, he could see the distant flickering lights of the Australian coastline. To his right, there was nothing but the blackness of the ocean. He was alone in a small metal bubble, listening to the steady drone of his engine. This is the part of the story that Frederick's family always comes back to. He was a young man with everything to lose and a career to build. He had been rejected by the Air Force twice because of his educational background, so he was determined to prove himself through civil aviation. He was disciplined, he was careful, he was exactly where he wanted to be. At 7 o'clock and 6 minutes, Frederick pressed the transmit button on his yoke. He contacted Melbourne Flight Service. A man named Steve Roby was on duty that night. Roby was a veteran air traffic controller used to the routine chatter of pilots moving between the mainland and the islands. But the question Frederick asked him was not part of any routine. Frederick asked if there was any known traffic in his area below 5,000 feet. Roby checked his radar screen. He looked at the sweeps, watching the green line move across the black glass. There was nothing. He told Frederick that there were no known aircraft in his vicinity. Frederick paused for a second, then keyed the mic again. His voice was still calm, but a bit more alert. He told Roby that there was something near him. He described it as a large aircraft with 4 bright lights. He said it looked like it was moving at high speed and had just passed over him at least 1,000 feet above. Roby checked the radar again. He checked with the military. He checked with the commercial hubs. There was absolutely nothing else in the sky. Frederick's reports became more frequent and more detailed. He said the object was now approaching him from the east. He described it as having a shiny metallic surface. It seemed to be playing a game with him. It would vanish and then reappear on the other side of his cockpit. It was moving so fast that it didn't seem to be flying as much as it was simply displacing itself. By 7 o'clock and 8 minutes, Frederick was beginning to sound worried. He told Roby that the object was now orbiting him. He was orbiting in a tight circle, and the lights were a brilliant, pulsing green. He tried to bank the Cessna to keep the object in sight, but it was too fast. It was as if the laws of physics that Frederick had studied so hard didn't apply to this thing. Then the engine began to act up. Frederick reported that the engine was rough, idling, and coughing. In a Cessna, when your engine starts to cough over the ocean at night, your heart drops. You start looking for a place to put the plane down, but below Frederick, there was only the Bay Strait, a stretch of water known for its freezing temperatures and massive swells. But Frederick wasn't looking at the water. He was looking up. He told Roby that the object was now hovering directly on top of him. He used that word specifically, hovering. He said it was stationary, just sitting there in the air, maintaining his exact speed and altitude without any visible means of propulsion. He said it's not an aircraft. Those were some of the last clear words he ever spoke. Roby asked him to describe the craft again. Frederick tried to answer, but his transmission was interrupted by a sound that Roby would later struggle to describe to investigators. It wasn't the sound of an engine failing. It wasn't the sound of a crash. It was a metallic, rhythmic clanging. It sounded like two massive sheets of steel being rubbed together, or a heavy hammer hitting a hollow pipe. It lasted for 17 seconds. During those 17 seconds, Frederick Valentich didn't scream. He didn't cry for help. He just left the channel open. And then at 7 o'clock and 12 minutes, the radio went completely and permanently silent. A massive search operation was launched almost immediately. The Australian Royal Air Force sent out Orion aircraft equipped with sophisticated sensors. Small boats and commercial ships scanned the surface of the Bay Strait for 4 days. They were looking for an oil slick, a piece of a wing, a life jacket, anything that would prove Frederick had hit the water. They found nothing. In a typical plane crash at sea, there is almost always some kind of debris. Light aircraft, like the Cessna 18-2, are made of materials that often float for a short time. There is upholstery, paper, manuals, and fuel that leaves an iridescent sheen on the surface. But the Bay Strait remained as clean and empty as it had been before the flight. The investigation that followed was one of the most exhaustive in Australian history. The Department of Transport looked into every possibility. They considered if Frederick had become disoriented and flown his plane upside down, mistaking the reflection of stars on the water for lights in the sky. But the Cessna isn't built for prolonged inverted flight. The engine would have quit much sooner. They looked into the possibility of a staged disappearance. Maybe Frederick wanted to start a new life. But he had no money, he hadn't packed any bags, and his bank account remained untouched. His father, Guido, insisted that his son was too proud of his pilot's license to ever abandon it. He was a young man who had found his purpose, not a man looking for an escape. The clanging sound on the tape remains the central mystery. Audio experts have spent decades trying to replicate it. They've tested engine failures, structural collapses, and microphone malfunctions. Nothing quite matches the cadence of those final 17 seconds. It sounds like something was physically interacting with the hull of the plane while it was still in the air. In the years that followed, several witnesses on the ground near the Bay Strait came forward. They claimed that on the night of October 21st, they had seen a strange green light moving across the sky at incredible speeds. One man even reported seeing a light following a small airplane. But without physical evidence, these stories remained just that, stories. Today, there is a small memorial plaque for Frederick Valentich at Cape Otway, looking out over the water where he was last heard. It doesn't offer any answers. It just lists his name and the date he vanished. The official file on the case was released in 2012, but it didn't contain a smoking gun. It only confirmed what the world already knew. The story of Frederick Valentich isn't just a story about a missing pilot. It's a story about the moment when the mundane world of checklists and radio frequencies collides with something that doesn't belong here. It's about a 20-year-old boy who spent his life looking at the stars, only to find that one of them was looking back. The search ended on October 25, 1978. The ships went home, the planes returned to their hangars, and the Bay Strait went back to being a dark, silent void. The only thing left of Frederick Valentich is a 17-second recording of metal screaming against metal and a radio channel that is still waiting for a response. At 3 o'clock in the morning, in the winding, dust-choked alleys of Jaipur, India, a man named Kampatimar Shankariya was walking through the shadows in a completely ordinary situation. Shankariya, a man in his early 20s, was the kind of person who could stand in a crowd for an hour and never be remembered. That night, he was simply wandering the silent streets, his hand wrapped tightly around a heavy iron masonry hammer hidden beneath a piece of rough cloth. To understand Shankariya, you have to understand the heat of Jaipur. In the summer, the temperature regularly climbs above 100 degrees, and the air stays hot long after the sun goes down. This heat dictated the way people lived. They would leave their windows open or sleep on their rooftops or set up cots in the narrow streets just to find a breath of moving air. It was a city of open doors and shared spaces, a place where people felt safe among their neighbors. Jaipur in the late 1970s was a place of extreme contrast. It was known as the Pink City because of the stunning stone used in its architecture. But by 1978, the city was groaning under the weight of too many people and too little infrastructure. The air was thick with the smell of coal, smoke, and spices. In the narrow lanes of the old city, the heat seemed to settle and stay, making the nights heavy and suffocating for everyone who lived there. Kampatimar Shankariya lived in the gaps between the buildings. He was a man who didn't seem to have a past or a future. He didn't have a home in the traditional sense. He just had places where he slept. To the vendors in the bazaar, he was just another day laborer looking for a few coins. He was young, lean, and possessed a stillness that was almost unnatural. He could stand perfectly still in the middle of a crowded street, and people would simply walk around him. He was remarkably unremarkable. To the people who lived near him, he was just another face in a sea of faces. But Shankariya had a very specific way of looking at the world. While other people were focused on finding their next meal or making a few extra rupees, he was focused on rhythm. He liked the sound of the city, but he felt like he was missing something. He felt like he was standing on the outside of life, looking into a world where he had no voice and no power. Shankariya lived in a world of silence. Because he was poor and had no family, he didn't exist in the eyes of the law or the eyes of the wealthy. He was a person who had been erased by his circumstances. He slept in the shadows of the old city walls, moving from one hiding spot to another like a stray cat. He watched the families eat their dinners through open windows, and he watched the children play in the dust. He was always there, but he was never invited to join. He didn't have friends, and he didn't have enemies. He was a person who lived in a complete social vacuum. In the evenings, he would often sit near the public water taps, watching people fill their brass pots and gossip about the day's events. He heard their laughter and their complaints, but he never felt the urge to join in. To him, they were like characters in a play that he was watching from the very back of the theater. He was content to be the one who observed everything. This invisibility wasn't just a circumstance of his poverty. It was something he nurtured. He watched the way people interacted, the way they looked past each other. He realized that most people are so wrapped up in their own lives that they never truly see what is standing right in front of them. This realization gave him a sense of power that he had never felt before. He began to think of himself as a spectator to a world that didn't know he existed. He was a shadow moving through light. One day he came across a construction site near a famous palace. He stood there for the entire afternoon watching a mason break heavy blocks of stone. The man used a specific kind of hammer with a short handle and a heavy square iron head. Every time the hammer hit the stone, there was a sharp, satisfying crack. Shankariya became obsessed with that sound. He felt that if he could just control that sound, he would finally have a voice in a world that refused to hear him. A few days later, he stole a hammer from a similar site. He didn't want a shiny new one. He wanted one that had already been used, one that felt heavy and balanced in his hand. He took a piece of old stained cloth and wrapped it around the head so that the cold metal wouldn't touch his skin. He tucked it into the waistband of his pants and started to walk. Suddenly, the city felt different. He wasn't just a ghost anymore. He was a ghost with a heavy iron purpose. For weeks, he just walked. This was the first small deviation that would lead to a nightmare. He would pick a person at random and follow them. He would follow a businessman coming home from a late meeting, or a mother carrying a sleeping child. He would get closer and closer, sometimes close enough to smell the sweat on their backs. He wanted to see how much of a threat he could be without actually doing anything. He was like a predator practicing his stalk before a hunt. The turning point came when he followed a man into a narrow, dead-end alley near the ancient city walls. The space was so tight that Shankariya could reach out and touch the damp stone on either side. The man was older and tired, his footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. Shankariya felt the weight of the hammer pressing against his hip. He didn't feel anger. He felt a cold, clinical curiosity. He reached for the heavy iron and stepped out of the shadows. The strike was quick and precise. The sound was even better than the stone breaking he had witnessed at the construction site. It was a heavy thud, followed by a sudden absolute silence. Shankariya stood there for a moment, waiting for the world to react. But the city just kept breathing. A dog barked in the distance, and the sound of a far-off truck rumbled through the air. He realized then that he could do this over and over again, and the world might never even notice. He would later tell investigators that the sound was exactly what he had hoped for. It was a deep, wet thud that signaled a complete end to the world for the person on the cot. He didn't feel guilty. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, like he had finally participated in something real. Over the next year, this routine became his entire life. He would wait until the city fell into its deepest sleep. Then he would emerge from his hiding spot with his hammer wrapped in cloth. Over the next several months, the frequency of his attacks increased. He didn't have a pattern. He would strike in the upscale neighborhoods and then disappear into the slums. He killed people in their sleep, often hitting them multiple times just to be sure. The city began to change. The vibrant nightlife of Jaipur vanished. The bazaars closed early and the streets were empty by 9 o'clock. The only people out after dark were the police and the man with the hammer. The early victims were often those who were the most vulnerable. A night watchman who had fallen asleep on his stool, a beggar who had found a quiet corner to rest, a laborer who was too tired to notice the footsteps behind him. Shankariya was careful. He would watch them for a long time, making sure they were truly alone. He would check the rhythm of their breathing, waiting for the exact moment when they were at their deepest point of sleep. Only then would he strike. The rumors began to spread like wildfire. Some people said it was a demon, others said it was a gang of professional assassins. The hammer man became a bogeyman that parents used to quiet their children. But the reality was much scarier. It was just one man who lived among them, a man who might have stood next to them in the tea shop that morning. The pressure on the local police was immense. The government was being criticized for its inability to protect its own citizens. The break in the case finally came from the forensic evidence, which was rare for the time. A young doctor noticed that the injuries were incredibly consistent. Every victim had been struck with a flat, square object that left a very specific indentation in the bone. This led the investigators to believe the killer was likely a laborer or someone with access to masonry tools. They began a massive undercover operation, placing officers in the labor camps and pretending to be workers. The police were under incredible pressure. They had no fingerprints and no witnesses. In 1978, forensic science in India was still developing, and the sheer volume of the crimes was overwhelming the local precinct. They set up checkpoints at every gate of the city, searching every bag and every vehicle. They questioned thousands of people, but Shankariya just sat in the shadows and watched them work. He was the invisible man in a city under a total state of siege. For the families of the victims, the horror was incomprehensible. They would wake up in the morning to find their loved ones dead in the next room, with no sign of a struggle and no explanation for why they had been targeted. There was no logic to who lived and who died. One night he might strike a wealthy shopkeeper, and the next he would kill a homeless man who had nothing but the clothes on his back. The randomness of it made the entire city feel like a massive target. One night, an undercover officer noticed a man who sat alone in the corner of a crowded camp. The man didn't talk to anyone, and he didn't seem to be looking for work. When the officer tried to strike up a conversation, the man just stared at him with eyes that seemed completely empty. The officer felt a sudden chill, a sense of danger that he couldn't quite explain. He noticed the man's hand was resting on a small, lumpy bundle wrapped in burlap. He knew he had found his man. The breakthrough finally happened with a small mistake. Shankariya had struck a victim near a well-known tool shop, and in his haste to leave, he had dropped a small piece of the burlap cloth he used to wrap his hammer. A detective noticed that the cloth was a very specific type of heavy-duty weave, used only in certain industrial shipping crates. This narrowed the search to the railway stations and the large shipping hubs on the outskirts of the city. The net was closing. The arrest was quick, but the discovery was horrifying. When the police unwrapped the burlap, they found the masonry hammer. It wasn't clean. It was covered in layers of dried blood that had never been washed off. Shankariya didn't fight back. He went with them quietly, almost as if he were relieved that the game was finally over. But the true horror was only beginning. As he started to talk, the investigators realized the scale of his crimes was larger than they had ever imagined. When they finally sat him down in the interrogation room, the officers were struck by how ordinary he looked. He wasn't a monster with claws. He was a tired young man in a dusty shirt. But when he started to describe the murders, his voice changed. He became animated, almost proud. He talked about the way the light would hit the hammer as it swung through the air, and how the silence of the night would be broken by that one perfect thud. It was a level of coldness they had never seen. He confessed to murder after murder, detailing the locations and the times with terrifying accuracy. He told them he had killed at least 70 people, though some investigators believed the number could be even higher. He explained his motive with a cold, logical simplicity that baffled the psychologists. He wasn't looking for money and he wasn't looking for fame. He was looking for that specific sound. He was a man who had turned a city into his own private laboratory of violence. The psychologists who examined him struggled to find a name for his condition. He wasn't motivated by money or desire. He was motivated by a sensory experience. He had become addicted to the sound of the impact, a sound that he believed was the only thing that truly belonged to him. In his mind, every strike was a way of making himself visible, even if the only person who saw him was his victim. It was a terrifying glimpse into a mind that had been completely broken by isolation. The trial was swift. In 1979, Kampatimar Shankariya was sentenced to death by hanging. The entire country watched as the man who had terrorized Jaipur was led to the gallows. He looked small and fragile in the morning light, a far cry from the monster that had haunted the city's dreams. His final words were a warning to the world, a rare moment of clarity where he seemed to understand that his search for power had only led to a complete and total void. The hammer was placed in a museum of criminology, a silent reminder of how easily a person can disappear into the shadows and become a monster. But the city of Jaipur would never be quite the same. The trust that had once bound the community together had been broken, replaced by a lingering fear of what might be hiding in the dark. The streets were safe again, but the world was changing, and the memory of that rhythmic thud would haunt the stone alleys for decades. Thousands of miles away, in a city just as crowded but far colder, another man was about to realize that some shadows are much harder to see than a man with a hammer. While Shankariya had used brute force to leave his mark, others were learning how to strike from a distance, using the very systems of society as their weapons. In the rainy streets of London, a man was about to find out that sometimes a simple umbrella can be just as deadly as a heavy iron hammer. On the morning of September 7th, 1978, on the rain-slicked pavement of Waterloo Bridge in London, a 49-year-old man named Georgi Markov was waiting for a bus in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Markov, a Bulgarian novelist and journalist, was the kind of person who valued his daily routine as a shield against a dangerous past. That morning, he was just another commuter in a trench coat, checking his watch and breathing in the cold, damp air of the Thames. The fog was clinging to the surface of the river, making the distant silhouettes of the city look like charcoal sketches on a gray canvas. To the thousands of people rushing past him, Georgi was just another face in the crowd, a man with a steady job at the BBC who was worried about being late for his shift. He stood near the bus stop pole, his collar turned up against the drizzle, watching the red double-decker buses crawl through the morning traffic. To understand why Georgi Markov was on that bridge, you have to understand the life he had left behind. In his native Bulgaria, Georgi hadn't just been a writer. He had been a celebrity. He was a favorite of the communist regime, a man who had been invited to the private hunting lodges of the country's dictator, Todor Zhivkov. He had everything a person could want, a high salary, a beautiful home, and the kind of social standing that usually meant you were untouchable. But Georgi was a man with a conscience that wouldn't let him rest. He saw the corruption of the elite from the inside, and he began to weave those observations into his plays and novels. At first, the regime tried to ignore it, but as his critiques became sharper, the pressure began to build. In 1969, he realized that he could no longer breathe in the stifling atmosphere of Sofia. He packed a single suitcase and defected to the West, eventually settling in London. By 1978, Georgi had built a new life for himself. He lived in a modest but comfortable apartment with his wife Annabelle and their young daughter. He worked for the BBC Wormul service, broadcasting a series of weekly reports called In Absentia, reports about life under the Bulgarian regime. These broadcasts were incredibly popular back home. People would huddle around illegal radios just to hear Georgi tell the truth about the men who were running their country. He knew he was a marked man. He had received several anonymous warnings telling him to stop the broadcasts or face the consequences. But in London, surrounded by the brick buildings and the polite protocols of British life, the threats felt distant. He felt safe in the routine of his commute. He liked the walk across Waterloo Bridge because it gave him a moment to think before he entered the bustling, high-pressure environment of the BBC's Bush House. Georgi was a man of habit. Every morning he would kiss his wife goodbye, walk the same route to the bridge, and wait for the same bus. He was a creature of the intellectual world, someone who spent his days debating politics and his evenings writing in his study. He felt that as long as he stayed in public places, among the witnesses of a free city, the reach of the Bulgarian secret police could never quite touch him. He was wrong about the reach. As Georgi stood there on the bridge, he felt a sharp, stinging pain in the back of his right thigh. It felt like a sudden needle prick or a wasp sting. He spun around his hand, instinctively going to the spot. Directly behind him was a man who had seemingly stumbled into him. The man was holding a heavy black umbrella and looking very embarrassed. He had a thick foreign accent as he mumbled an apology about his clumsiness on the slick pavement. The man didn't stick around to chat. He immediately hailed a nearby black cab, jumped inside, and disappeared into the London traffic. Georgi watched the taxi go, feeling a bit annoyed, but mostly just confused. The sting was fading into a dull ache, and he figured the tip of the umbrella had just caught him at a bad angle through his trousers. He boarded his bus a few minutes later, and went about his day at the BBC as if nothing had happened. He even joked about the incident with his colleagues. He told them about the clumsy man with the umbrella and the strange sting in his leg. He showed one of them the spot, which was just a tiny red puncture wound, no larger than a mosquito bite. He didn't feel sick, and he didn't feel dizzy. He just felt the minor irritation of a small injury. But as the afternoon turned into evening, the mundane nature of the morning began to take a terrifying turn. By the time Georgi arrived home that evening, he was shivering. His temperature was rising rapidly, and he felt a bone-deep exhaustion that he couldn't explain. He told Annabelle about the umbrella, strike again, this time with a note of genuine worry in his voice. He went to bed early, but he couldn't sleep. He spent the night tossing and turning, his body racked by a fever that seemed to be coming from inside his very cells. The next morning, Georgi was in a state of complete collapse. He was vomiting, his blood pressure had plummeted, and his speech was becoming slurred. Annabelle called an ambulance, and he was rushed to St. James's Hospital. The doctors were baffled. He had all the symptoms of a massive systemic infection, but his white blood cell count was behaving in a way they had never seen. It was as if his entire immune system was being dismantled from the inside out. For 3 days, the medical team fought to keep him alive. They pumped him full of the strongest antibiotics they had, but nothing worked. Georgi's kidneys began to fail, and then his heart started to falter. He was conscious just long enough to tell the doctors one more time about the man on the bridge and the sting of the umbrella. He was convinced he had been poisoned, but the doctors couldn't find a single trace of any known toxin in his blood. On the morning of September 11th, 1978, Georgi Markov died. He was 49 years old. The case was immediately handed over to Scotland Yard's Counter-Terrorism Command. They knew Georgi's history, and they knew about the threats he had received. They also knew that a defector dying of a mysterious illness in a London hospital was exactly the kind of thing that started international incidents. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. The breakthrough didn't come in a lab or an interrogation room. It came in the morgue. A forensic pathologist named Dr. Bernard Riley was performing the autopsy when he noticed something strange about the small wound on Georgi's thigh. He removed a small piece of the surrounding tissue and placed it under a high-powered microscope. He wasn't looking for a chemical. He was looking for a physical object. And in the center of that tissue, he found it. It was a tiny, shimmering speck of metal. It was so small that if it had fallen on the floor, you would never have found it. Using a pair of precision tweezers, Dr. Riley extracted a pellet made of a platinum iridium alloy. It was exactly 1.52 millimeters in diameter, roughly the size of a pinhead. When he looked at the pellet under even higher magnification, he realized he was looking at a masterpiece of lethal engineering. The pellet had been meticulously drilled with two microscopic holes, each only 0.35 millimeters wide. These holes had been positioned so that they formed a cross-shaped cavity inside the metal. The pellet was empty when they found it, but the forensic team realized that the holes had been filled with a substance and then sealed with a thin layer of sugar-based wax. It was a delivery system designed for one purpose: delayed assassination. The scientists at the chemical defense establishment at Porton Down were called in to identify the substance. Based on the symptoms and the microscopic amount of space inside the pellet, they concluded that the killer had used ricin. Ricin is a toxin derived from castor beans, and in 1978 it was one of the deadliest substances on the planet. There was no antidote, and the amount needed to kill a man was smaller than a single grain of salt. The logic of the weapon was chillingly brilliant. The wax coating was designed to melt at exactly 98.6 degrees human body temperature. Once the pellet was shot into Georgi's leg by a pressurized air mechanism hidden inside the umbrella, it sat silently in his tissue. For several hours, the wax slowly dissolved. By the time the ricin was released into his bloodstream and the symptoms began, the assassin was already on a plane back to Eastern Europe. The investigation into the man with the umbrella spanned decades. Codenamed Agent Piccadilly by the Bulgarian Secret Service, the primary suspect was eventually identified as a man named Francesco Golino. Golino was a Danish national who had been recruited by the Bulgarians. He was a professional who knew how to disappear into a crowd. Despite being questioned in the early 90s, he was never charged, and he took the secrets of the assassination to his grave. The murder of Georgi Markov changed the way the West looked at the Cold War. It proved that the Iron Curtain wasn't a wall that kept people in. It was a reach that could extend into the heart of London. It turned a rainy morning commute into a battlefield. Georgi had survived the censorship and the hunters of his homeland, only to be taken down by a microscopic pellet and a polite apology on a bridge thousands of miles away. Today, Waterloo Bridge looks exactly the same as it did that September morning. Thousands of people still cross it every day, their collars turned up against the wind, their eyes fixed on their watches. They walk past the spot where Georgi stood, never realizing that the pavement beneath their feet was once the site of a perfect invisible strike. The bridge remains a silent witness to the cost of telling the truth in a world of shadows. But even as the mystery of the umbrella was being unraveled in a London lab, another group of people was realizing that some disappearances don't happen in the middle of a crowd. They happen in the quiet, empty spaces where no one is looking. Only a few months after Georgi took his last breath, 4 young people in Indiana were about to walk out of a brightly lit restaurant and into a darkness that would never let them go. At 11 o'clock, on the night of November 17th, 1978, in the quiet town of Speedway, Indiana, 4 young employees at a Burger Chef restaurant were in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Jane Freed, a 20-year-old assistant manager, was the kind of person who led by example and took pride in her responsibility. That evening, she was simply finishing up the final closing tasks and making sure the kitchen was clean. Jane was the heart of that late-night crew. At 20, she was a few years older than the boys she managed, and she took that role seriously. She drove a white Chevrolet Vega, her pride and joy, which she parked right near the back entrance every night. She was the kind of person who knew her regulars by name and never minded staying an extra 10 minutes to help a coworker finish their chores. Working with her that night were 3 teenagers who were just starting their own lives. There was 18-year-old Ruth Shelton, a soft-spoken girl who sang in her church choir and dreamed of becoming a school teacher. She was steady and reliable, the kind of person who never missed a shift. Then there was 16-year-old Danny Davis, a high school junior who loved photography and was saving up his paychecks to buy a better camera and lenses for his hobby. The youngest of the group was 16-year-old Mark Flemons. Mark was a star athlete at his high school and had only recently started working at the Burger Chef to help his family with expenses. He was known for his quick smile and his ability to make even the most boring cleaning tasks feel like a game. These 4 were more than just coworkers. They were a team that functioned with a rhythmic, practiced ease that made the long shifts go by quickly. The Burger Chef itself was a classic piece of Midwestern Americana. It was located on Crawley Road, just a few minutes away from the famous Indianapolis Motor Speedway. On a Friday night in November, the air was crisp and smelled of damp leaves and deep fryer oil. Inside, the lights were warm and bright, casting a safe glow onto the empty parking lot. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen to anyone, especially not kids. Speedway was the kind of town where the tracks of the race cars defined the culture, and the local fast food joints were the social hubs for the youth. People felt a sense of security in the predictable layout of the suburbs. The Burger Chef was a beacon of that normalcy, a place where families grabbed dinner and teenagers earned their first paychecks. For Jane, Ruth, Danny, and Mark, it was just another Friday night shift, ending with a familiar smell of grilled beef and salt. Jane spent a lot of her time thinking about her future, but she was grounded in the present needs of her team. She made sure that the kitchen staff followed the safety protocols and that the front counter was always presentable. She had a way of correcting the younger boys without making them feel small. She understood that for Mark and Danny, this was more than just a job. It was a rite of passage, a way to learn how to be men in a world that was moving faster every year. Ruth Shelton often spent the quiet moments of the shift talking to Jane about her plans for college. She was a girl who valued her community and her faith, and she brought a sense of calm to the often chaotic environment of a busy restaurant. She was the one who would stay late to help Jane count the change or organize the storage room. There was a quiet strength in Ruth, a reliability that Jane depended on during the heavy rush hours of the weekend. Danny Davis was the dreamer of the group. He often brought his camera to work, hoping to catch a candid shot of his friends during their breaks. He was fascinated by the way light hit the stainless steel surfaces of the kitchen and the way the neon signs reflected in the puddles of the parking lot. He was a kid who looked at the world through a lens, always trying to find the beauty in the mundane. To him, the Burger Chef was a stage where life played out in small, meaningful moments. Mark Flemons was the energy of the crew. Even after a long day of school and football practice, he would arrive at work with a level of enthusiasm that was infectious. He was the one who would crack jokes to break the tension when the orders backed up or the milkshake machine broke down. He was a natural athlete, moving with a grace that seemed out of place behind a fast food counter. His coworkers admired his work ethic and his unwavering positivity, even on the coldest Indiana nights. By 11 o'clock, the last customer had long since departed, and the neon open sign had been flicked off. The crew had followed their standard closing routine with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. They had emptied the industrial trash bins, wiped down the plastic tables, and placed the leftover rolls into plastic bags for the morning shift. Jane was in the small back office, sitting at a metal desk and carefully counting the night's earnings for the final deposit. The safe contained about $581. In 1978, that was a significant amount of cash for a suburban restaurant to have on hand, but it wasn't a king's ransom. Jane placed the bills into a canvas bank bag, her mind likely already on the short drive home in her Vega. The rest of the crew was finishing the floor, the rhythmic sound of the mop bucket being dragged across the tiles echoing through the empty dining room. Everything seemed perfectly normal until about 11:15. A fellow employee from a nearby store drove past the Burger Chef and noticed something slightly off. He saw two men sitting in a dark-colored car in the back of the parking lot, tucked away in the shadows, where the light from the street lamps didn't quite reach. He didn't think much of it at the time. Speedway was a safe town, and it wasn't unusual for people to linger near the restaurant after closing. But then the back door was propped open. This was a direct violation of company policy. The back door was supposed to be locked tight the moment the sun went down to prevent exactly what was about to happen. As the minutes ticked toward midnight, the bright interior of the Burger Chef stayed lit, but the movement inside stopped. The white Vega was still in its spot, and the lights were still humming, but the four young people inside had simply vanished into the night. At midnight, another employee arrived to help with some overnight prep work. He walked up to the back door and found it standing wide open, a cold draft blowing into the warm kitchen. He stepped inside, expecting to hear the usual banter of the closing crew, but the kitchen was silent. The fryers were still warm, and the heat from the grill was still radiating into the room, but the restaurant was completely empty. He called out their names, but there was no answer. He walked into the back office and saw that the safe was standing open and empty. The $581 was gone. He looked for Jane's purse and the jackets of the other three employees, but they were missing from their usual hooks. He ran back outside to the parking lot, his breath visible in the freezing air. Jane's white Vega was gone. It was as if a giant hand had reached into the building and plucked the four of them out of existence. The police were called, but the initial response was catastrophically slow. Because the safe was empty and the employees were missing, along with the assistant manager's car, the responding officers assumed it was a case of petty embezzlement. They figured the four of them had simply decided to rob the place and go on a joyride. They told the morning manager that it wasn't a crime scene. They didn't secure the building. They didn't look for fingerprints or footprints. Because the police didn't think it was a serious crime, they allowed the restaurant to be cleaned. On Saturday morning, the staff arrived and scrubbed the floors, wiped down the counters, and threw away the trash from the night before. They literally washed away every single piece of forensic evidence that might have told the story of what happened in those final minutes. It was a mistake that would haunt the investigation and the families of the victims for the next 50 years. On Saturday afternoon, Jane's white Vega was found abandoned in a residential area just a few miles away. The car was unlocked and the keys were missing. There was no blood and no obvious signs of a struggle, but there was also no sign of the money. The families of the four missing employees began to gather at the police station, their fear turning into a desperate, cold realization that this wasn't a joyride. No one could believe that these four would ever just walk away. The search expanded into the surrounding countryside. Hundreds of volunteers joined the police, trekking through the freezing Indiana woods and searching the muddy creek beds. The weather was turning bitter, with a light dusting of snow covering the brown dead grass of late autumn. The community was in a state of total shock. Speedway was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, but now every shadow and every alleyway felt like a physical threat. On Sunday afternoon, two hikers were walking through a heavily wooded area in Johnson County, about 20 miles south of the restaurant. They noticed something bright among the fallen leaves and the gray underbrush. As they got closer, they realized they were looking at the blue uniforms of the Burger Chef employees. The four young people were lying in a small clearing. They were still wearing their work clothes, their polyester vests, a stark, unnatural color against the winter forest. The scene was more brutal than anyone had prepared for. Jane Freed and Ruth Shelton had been stabbed multiple times with a sharp, thin blade. Danny Davis and Mark Flemons had been shot in the back of the head with a small caliber firearm. Mark, the youngest, had also been severely beaten. He had tried to run, but he had fallen and choked on his own blood in the cold mud. There was no money found at the scene. They had been killed for less than $150 each. As the investigators looked closer, they realized the killers had used a very specific type of weapon. One of the blades used in the stabbing had broken off during the attack, leaving a small piece of steel embedded in the bone of one of the victims. This piece of metal would become one of the only physical clues in the entire case. They also realized that the killers must have had a vehicle capable of carrying four captives 20 miles without being noticed, suggesting a van. The investigation became a maze of dead ends. Rumors began to swirl about a group of local men known as the Fast Food Gang. They were a loose collection of robbers who specialized in hitting small restaurants at closing time. Several witnesses reported seeing two men with beards near the Burger Chef on the night of the disappearance. One of these men was allegedly seen carrying a long, thin object wrapped in a cloth, but every time the police got close to a suspect, the lead evaporated. Over the years, several men confessed to the murders, but their stories never matched the evidence found at the scene. One man even claimed he had been hired to scare the employees because of a gambling debt, but he couldn't provide any details about the woods or the specific way the victims died. The fact that the restaurant had been cleaned on that first morning meant there was no DNA, no hair, and no fibers to link any of the primary suspects to the interior of the store. In 2024, a breakthrough in forensic genealogy offered a final glimmer of hope. Investigators began testing the broken blade and the clothing of the victims for minute traces of touch DNA. They were looking for a family connection that could finally point to the men in the dark car. They hoped to find a name that had been overlooked in the thousands of pages of old police reports. But as of today, the case remains officially and tragically unsolved. The Burger Chef and Speedway was eventually turned off for good, and the building was later torn down to make way for new development. All that remains of that Friday night is the lingering scent of damp autumn leaves in a dark forest where four young people went to sleep and never woke up. The silence of the Indiana woods is a heavy thing, but it's nothing compared to the absolute silence of the deep Pacific, where another mystery was waiting to be found. Thousands of miles to the west, another group of friends was about to realize that the land isn't the only place where a routine trip can turn into a ghost story. On a bright afternoon in Hawaii, 5 men were loading a small boat named the Sarah Joe, thinking about nothing but the fish they were going to catch before the sun went down. They were checking their lines and laughing, unaware that their boat was about to drift into a place where time and logic simply ceased to exist. On the morning of February 11th, 1979, on the sun-drenched coast of Maui, Hawaii, 5 close friends were loading a small motorboat in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Scott Moorman, who was 27 years old, was the kind of person who lived for the open water and the thrill of the catch. That morning, he was just securing the fishing gear and checking the fuel lines, preparing for a quick trip. Scott was a man who felt more at home on the deck of a boat than he did on dry land. He had moved to the islands from the mainland years earlier, drawn by the promise of a life that wasn't dictated by a punch clock or a cubicle. He worked as a local carpenter to pay the bills, but everyone who knew him understood that his real life began the second he pushed off from the pier. He was meticulous about his equipment and respected the ocean. His friends were cut from the same cloth. There was Benjamin Kalama, Peter Hanchett, James McCoy, and Ralph Maliakini. They were all in their 20s and 30s, a group of hardworking men who shared a deep, unspoken bond forged in the salt air. They weren't tourists playing at being sailors. They were locals who knew the reefs, the currents, and the subtle moods of the Pacific. To them, the ocean was a neighbor they visited, every chance they got. The boat they were using that Tuesday was a 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe. Now in the world of boating, a Boston whaler is legendary. They are built with a unique foam core construction that makes them virtually unsinkable. Even if you were to saw the hull in half, the pieces would supposedly still float. This gave the 5 men a sense of security that was almost absolute. If anything went wrong, the Sarah Joe would keep them on the surface. That morning was particularly beautiful. The trade winds were light, and the water was like a sheet of dark blue glass. They had heard whispers that the ahi or yellowfin tuna were running particularly well a few miles offshore. They planned to spend the day out on the water, fill their coolers with fresh fish, and be back at the pier in time to watch the sunset with their families. It was the kind of plan they had made 100 times before. Scott spent the first hour of the trip organizing the lures and checking the radio. He was a man of few words, but he had a presence that made everyone around him feel at ease. He was the one they looked to when the weather got choppy or the lines got tangled. He had a way of reading the waves that seemed like a sixth sense. As the coastline of Maui began to shrink behind them, the 5 friends were laughing and enjoying the simple freedom of the open sea. By 10 o'clock, they were several miles out, and the shore was just a thin green line on the horizon. The air was warm, and the only sound was the steady, comforting hum of the 85-horsepower outboard motor. They had no reason to look at the sky with anything but appreciation. But the Pacific is a living thing, and in 1979, the technology we had to monitor its temper was nothing compared to what we have today. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from the water. It came from the wind. It didn't just pick up. It shifted. It went from a gentle breeze to a sharp, cold gust that smelled of distant rain and deep pressure. Scott looked over his shoulder and saw the horizon was no longer blue. It had turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple. A massive Kona storm, a rare and violent weather event, was screaming toward them from the opposite direction. Within 20 minutes, the glass-like water had transformed into a churning nightmare. The waves weren't just growing. They were stacking on top of each other, forming walls of water that were 10 and 15 feet high. The Sarah Joe, for all its structural strength, was still only a 17-foot open boat. It was being tossed around like a plastic toy in a bathtub. Scott gripped the steering wheel, trying to keep the boat pointed into the waves. The rain started as a mist, and quickly turned into a deluge that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of the boat. The wind was howling at over 60 miles per hour, whipping the spray into a blinding white fog. The men had to shout just to be heard over the roar of the elements. They were no longer fishing. They were fighting for their lives. Every time the Sarah Joe climbed a wave, it felt like it might flip over backward into the abyss. Back on shore, the families were watching the sky with growing dread. The storm had hit the coast with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. Boats that were still in the harbor were being battered against the docks, and the palm trees were bending nearly to the ground. They knew the 5 men were out there somewhere, and they knew the Sarah Joe was too small to survive a direct hit from a storm of this magnitude. The panic began to set in. The Coast Guard was notified, but the conditions were too dangerous for a rescue mission to launch immediately. They had to wait for the worst of the wind to pass before they could send up the C-130 search planes. For the families of Scott, Benjamin, Peter, James, and Ralph, those first few hours were an agonizing wait in the dark. They gathered at the pier, huddled together in the rain, hoping to see the small white hull of the Sarah Joe emerge from the mist. When the search finally began, it was one of the largest in the history of the Hawaiian Islands. For 5 days, the Coast Guard and dozens of local volunteers scanned more than 70,000 square miles of ocean. They used every piece of technology available at the time, from radar to infrared sensors. They flew low over the water looking for a life jacket, a piece of debris, or even an oil slick. But the ocean was perfectly, terrifyingly clean. As the days turned into a week, the hope began to fade. The experts explained that even an unsinkable boat could be overwhelmed by waves that large. They suggested the boat might have been capsized and the men swept away, or that the hull had been smashed against a reef. But the lack of any debris was the part that didn't make sense. Usually when a boat goes down, something floats to the surface. But for the Sarah Joe, there was nothing but silence. The search was officially called off, and a memorial service was held for the 5 men. For the next 9 years, their names were whispered in Maui as a cautionary tale about the power of the sea. Their families eventually moved on as much as anyone can after a tragedy without a body. They accepted that the men were gone, swallowed by the Pacific, in a storm that had become part of local legend. The story of the Sarah Joe was over, or so everyone thought. Then came the year 1988. Thousands of miles to the west, in a remote and desolate part of the Marshall Islands, a marine biologist named John Naughton was conducting a survey of an uninhabited atoll called Taongi. This place is about as isolated as it gets. It's a tiny ring of sand and scrub brush surrounded by thousands of miles of empty water. There is no fresh water there, which is why humans have never settled on it. Naughton was walking along the windward shore of the atoll, dodging the thousands of nesting seabirds that call the island home, when he saw something white reflecting in the sun. As he got closer, his heart began to race. It was the hull of a small boat, half buried in the sand and encrusted with salt and barnacles. He cleared away the debris and saw the registration numbers on the side. It was the Sarah Joe, 2,300 miles from home. The boat was in remarkably good shape for something that had supposedly been at sea for 9 years. The motor was gone and the deck was bleached white by the sun, but the hull was intact. Naughton knew about the disappearance, and he immediately began to search the surrounding area. About 100 yards away from the wreck, he found a small, shallow grave. It was a simple mound of sand covered with a layer of flat stones and coral. Inside the grave, Naughton found a single human bone, a jawbone. Beside it were several other smaller fragments of bone, but nothing else. He also noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. Resting on top of the grave were hundreds of tiny rectangular slips of paper. They were arranged in a specific ritualistic pattern, held down by small pebbles so the wind wouldn't blow them away. They looked like something out of a religious ceremony. Naughton carefully collected the bone and the paper and sent them back to Hawaii for testing. The jawbone was eventually identified through dental records as belonging to Scott Mormon. The paper fragments were analyzed by experts who determined they were pieces of a traditional Chinese manuscript used in burial rites to provide the deceased with money and luck in the afterlife. It was as if someone had found Scott and given him a proper ritualistic burial. But here is where the story defies all logic. Taongi Atoll was uninhabited. No one had been authorized to be on that island in years. Furthermore, the Marshall Islands are located in a part of the Pacific where the currents flow from east to west, but they don't flow in a straight line from Hawaii. For a 17-foot boat to drift 2,300 miles and land on a tiny speck of sand is a mathematical impossibility that experts still can't explain. Even more confusing was the timing. The biologist had visited that exact same beach just a few years earlier, and the boat had not been there. This meant the Sarah Joe had been drifting or had been somewhere else for years, before it finally washed up on Taongi. If someone had found Scott Mormon's body and buried him with Chinese ritual papers, where were they? And what had happened to the other 4 men who were on the boat that morning in Maui? The discovery of the grave only created more questions than it answered. If illegal fishermen had found the boat and buried Scott, why didn't they report it? And why would they use such a specific ancient ritual for a man they didn't know? The 4 other men, Benjamin, Peter, James, and Ralph, have never been found. There was no sign of them on the island, and no other graves were ever discovered. They simply vanished into the blue. The families were given Scott's remains, and he was finally laid to rest in the soil of Hawaii. But the mystery of those 9 years remains a black hole in the history of the islands. To this day, people look out at the Bass Strait and the deep Pacific and wonder if the ocean is just a body of water or if it's a gateway to something we don't yet understand. The Sarajevo came back, but it brought back a ghost story instead of an answer. The only thing left is the memory of that bright morning in 1979 and the image of 5 friends laughing as they headed out to catch the ahi. They thought they were in control of their day, unaware that they were about to be pulled into a mystery that would stretch across a decade and thousands of miles of empty sea. The white glare of the salt-crusted sand on Taongi is a silent monument to a journey that should have been impossible. But as strange as the disappearance of the Sarajevo was, some nightmares don't happen on the open ocean. They happen in the places where we feel the safest, in the towns where we grew up, in the forests where we played as children. Just a year before, Scott Mormon's boat vanished. 5 other young men were driving home from a basketball game in California, completely unaware that a wrong turn was about to lead them into a frozen psychological trap. On the night of February 24th, 1978, in the bright echoing gym of California State University in Chico, 5 young men were sitting in the stands in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Jack Madruga, who was 30 years old, was the kind of person who found deep comfort in a schedule. That evening, he was just cheering for the UC Davis basketball team, checking his watch and making sure his 4 best friends were having a good time before the drive home. Jack Madruga was the one with the driver's license, and the car a turquoise 1969 Mercury Montego that he kept in pristine condition. He was a veteran of the Army and a man who took his responsibilities to his friends very seriously. He worked as a dishwasher at a local training center and lived with his mother. To Jack, the world made sense when he followed the rules and kept his car clean. He wasn't a man who took risks or liked surprises. The group of 5 was a tight-knit unit, and each of them had their own specific way of interacting with the world. They all had either a mild intellectual disability or a psychiatric condition, but they had spent years learning how to navigate life together. They were all members of a basketball team called the Gateway Gators, and the next day they were supposed to play their first game in a major regional tournament in Sacramento. The excitement in the gym that night was almost electric. Sitting next to Jack was 32-year-old Ted Weyer. Ted was a big, friendly man who was known for his incredible memory and his deep love for his family. He was the kind of person who would stop to talk to anyone on the street, and he was the emotional anchor of the group. He worked as a janitor and was saving up his money to buy a new bicycle. Ted was a creature of habit who hated being late and always made sure he was dressed neatly for any social outing. Bill Sterling was 29 years old and had been Jack Madruga's best friend since they were children. Bill was a deeply religious man who spent much of his free time reading the Bible and helping out at his local church. He was quiet and reserved, preferring to listen rather than talk. He worked at a local car wash and was known for his patience. Bill relied on Jack for transportation and guidance, and in return he provided Jack with a loyal and steady presence. 24-year-old Jack Hewitt was the baby of the group. He was shy and often struggled with basic tasks, but he felt safe and confident when he was with the other 4 men. He looked up to Ted Weyer like a big brother and followed him everywhere. Jack Hewitt lived with his parents and was extremely close to his mother. He was a kind-hearted young man who loved animals and was always the first to offer a hand if someone in the group needed help. The 5th member of the group was 25-year-old Gary Mathias. Gary was slightly different from the others. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had spent time in a psychiatric hospital, but he had been stable for years thanks to his medication. He was a talented athlete and worked at his stepfather's gardening business. Gary was the most physically capable of the group, having served in the Army like Jack Madruga. He was a focused and intense young man who took the Gators' games very seriously. For most of their lives, these 5 men had existed in a world that was predictable and safe. They lived in Yuba City and Marysville towns, where everyone knew their names and their families. They had their routines at the Gateway Training Center, their Friday night outings, and their basketball practices. They were valued members of their community, and their parents worked hard to ensure they had as much independence as possible while still being protected from the complexities of the world. The game in Chico ended around 10 o'clock. The 5 men were in high spirits as they walked out into the cool night air. They stopped at a local bagels convenience store to pick up some snacks for the drive back south to Yuba City. They bought several candy bars, some sodas, and a few bags of chips. The clerk at the store later remembered them because they were so polite and happy, talking excitedly about the tournament game they were going to play the next morning. They piled into Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego and pulled out of the parking lot. The drive from Chico to Yuba City is a straight, easy shot south on Highway 70. It should have taken them less than an hour to get home. Their parents were expecting them by 11 or 11:30 at the latest. They each had their uniforms laid out for the next day, their shoes polished and their bags packed. Everything was perfectly aligned for a successful weekend of basketball. But for some reason, that remains one of the greatest mysteries in American history. The turquoise Mercury Montego did not turn south. Instead, it headed northeast toward the rugged and treacherous terrain of the Plumas National Forest. This was the first small deviation that would lead to a nightmare. The road they took was a winding, narrow mountain track that climbed thousands of feet into the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was a road that led to nowhere, especially in the middle of a winter night. As the car climbed higher, the temperature dropped and the rain turned into a light, swirling snow. The road was unpaved and muddy, filled with deep ruts and sharp rocks. This wasn't a road for a 1969 sedan. It was a road for four-wheel drive trucks. Yet, Jack Madruga kept driving. He drove for nearly 2 hours, pushing the car further and further into the wilderness, far past the point where any reasonable person would have realized they had made a catastrophic wrong turn. The car eventually came to a stop in a small snowdrift. It wasn't actually stuck in a way that would prevent it from being moved. Investigators would later find that the tires had plenty of traction and the engine had more than enough fuel. But for some reason, the 5 men got out of the car. They didn't try to push it out. They didn't try to turn it around. They simply walked away from the warmth and safety of the Montego and headed deeper into the pitch-black forest. Around the same time, a man named Joseph Shans was sitting in his own car just a few hundred yards away. He had gotten stuck in the snow earlier that evening and had suffered a mild heart attack while trying to push his vehicle out. He was lying in his seat, drifting in and out of consciousness, when he saw the lights of the Mercury Montego behind him. He heard voices and saw the silhouettes of several men and what appeared to be a woman carrying a baby. Joseph Shans cried out for help. He yelled until his throat was raw, but the figures in the dark didn't respond. He later told police that they seemed to just stop and listen for a moment before moving on into the woods. They didn't seem panicked. They seemed focused on something else. Sean spent the night in his car terrified and alone, watching the strange lights of the men's flashlights flicker through the trees until they finally vanished into the winter silence. The next morning, the families of the 5 men realized something was terribly wrong. None of them had returned home, and none of them had shown up for the basketball tournament. This was completely out of character for all of them. The parents called each other, and then they called the police. A massive search was launched, covering hundreds of square miles. A few days later, a forest ranger found the Mercury Montego abandoned on that remote mountain road, exactly where Jack Madruga had left it. The car was unlocked, and the keys were missing. Inside, the police found the wrappers from the snacks they had bought at the convenience store in Chico. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no footprints leading away from the car because the fresh snow had covered everything. The search continued for weeks through blizzards and freezing temperatures, but as the winter deepened, the authorities had to call off the operation. The Yuba County 5 had simply disappeared into the mountain. It wasn't until June, when the snow finally began to melt, that the first grisly discovery was made. A group of motorcyclists was riding past a Forest Service trailer about 19 miles away from where the car had been found. They noticed a window was broken and a foul smell was coming from inside. When the police arrived and opened the door, they found a scene that defied all logic and medical science. They found Ted Wire lying on a bed wrapped in 8 sheets. Ted Wire had been dead for a long time, but he hadn't died on the night of the disappearance. An autopsy revealed that Ted had lived in that trailer for anywhere from 8 to 13 weeks. He had lost nearly half of his body weight, his feet were black with frostbite, and he had literally starved to death. But the trailer wasn't empty. Just a few feet away from the bed where Ted died, there was a storage locker filled with enough canned food to feed 5 men for an entire year. Ted had never opened a single can of the main rations. He had only eaten about a dozen small C-ration meals that were stored in a different cabinet. These sea rations had been opened with a P-38 military-style can opener, something that only Jack Madruga or Gary Mathias would have known how to use. This meant that at least one of the other men had been in that trailer with Ted for a period of time, but for some reason they had never helped him get into the larger supply of food. Even more disturbing was the fact that there was a large tank of propane right outside the trailer that powered a heater. The heater was in perfect working order, but it had never been turned on. There were also matches and paper inside the trailer, but no one had ever started a fire. Ted Weiher had slowly frozen and starved to death in a room that was filled with everything he needed to survive. It was as if he had been paralyzed by a psychological barrier he couldn't break. Over the next few days, the remains of the other men were found. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were discovered in the woods, about halfway between the car and the trailer. They had likely died of hypothermia on that first night. The bones of Jack Hewitt were found near the trailer, scattered by animals. But the fifth man, Gary Mathias, was never found. His shoes were found inside the trailer, which meant he had been there, but his body was gone. To this day, Gary Mathias remains a missing person. The investigation was plagued by questions that had no answers. Why did they drive up the mountain in the first place? Why did they leave a functional car? Why did they walk 19 miles through a blizzard in their street clothes and light jackets? And why did Ted Weiher die in a trailer full of food and heat? Some people suggested they were chased, while others thought they had simply followed a light in the distance, becoming more and more disoriented as the cold took hold of their minds. The families of the men remained convinced that something or someone forced them up that mountain. They pointed to the fact that Jack Madruga loved his car and would never have driven it onto such a rough road voluntarily. They pointed to the Schultz sighting and the mysterious woman with a baby that was never explained. But without Gary Mathias, the only person who might have had the physical and mental capacity to explain the events of that night, the truth remains buried in the Sierra Nevada. The case of the Yuba County Five is often called America's Dyatlov Pass because it involves a group of people making inexplicable decisions that led to their deaths in the wilderness. It's a story about the fragility of the human mind when it's removed from the safety of its routine. Ted Weiher spent his final weeks in a dark, silent trailer, surrounded by life-saving supplies he couldn't bring himself to touch, waiting for a rescue that would never arrive before the snow finally claimed him. The mountain is quiet now, and the road where the Mercury Montego stopped has long since been reclaimed by the forest. But the mystery of what happened in those woods in 1978 continues to haunt everyone who hears it. It is a reminder that the world is a much larger and more dangerous place than we often realize, and that sometimes a single wrong turn can lead to a destination that was never on the map. But as chilling as the silence of the Plumas National Forest is, there are some crimes where the silence is even more intentional. Thousands of miles away, in the crowded, high-density apartments of Singapore, another tragedy was about to unfold. On a bright morning in 1979, a mother was going about her daily routine, unaware that a killer who knew her, every secret, was waiting for her to step out of the door, ready to turn a family home into a place of absolute horror. At 6:30 in the morning on January 6th, 1979, in a busy residential neighborhood called Gailang Baru in Singapore, a 30-year-old woman named Lee Mei Ying was starting her day in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Mei Ying was the kind of person who found her purpose in the hard, repetitive work of providing for her family. That morning, she was just checking the oil in her minibus and warming up the engine, preparing for her first round of student pickups. Singapore in the late 1970s was a place of rapid, dizzying change. The city was transforming from a colonial port into a modern, high-tech metropolis. For families like the Tans, this meant moving out of traditional wooden kampongs and into the soaring concrete towers of government housing. They lived in Block 58, a massive HDB flat that was a vertical village in itself. Everyone knew everyone's business, but there was a deep sense of shared progress and safety in those crowded hallways. Mei Ying was the primary driver for a small private school bus service. She was a disciplined woman who took immense pride in her punctuality. She had to be. Dozens of parents relied on her to get their children to school safely every single day. She was a familiar sight in the neighborhood, her minibus weaving through the narrow streets, while the sun was still just an orange glow on the horizon. To Mei Ying, the rhythm of the bus engine was the sound of her family's future being built. Her husband Tan Quen Chai was just as hard-working. He spent his days at a nearby factory working long shifts to ensure his 4 children had everything they needed. Quen Chai was a quiet man, respected by his neighbors for his dedication and his humble nature. He and Mei Ying were part of a generation that believed if you worked hard enough and followed the rules, the city would take care of you. They were a success story of the new Singapore, a family moving upward. Their 4 children were the center of their universe. There was 10-year-old Tan Kok Peng, the eldest and the leader of the group. He was a bright, responsible boy who looked after his younger siblings with a maturity that went beyond his years. He was the one who made sure their school uniforms were laid out and that their bags were packed. Kok Peng was his mother's right hand, the one she trusted to keep the household running smoothly while she was out on her morning routes. 8-year-old Tan Kok Hin was the playful one. He was always the first to crack a joke or find a reason to laugh, even in the early hours of the morning. He admired his older brother deeply and followed him everywhere. Then there was 6-year-old Tan Kok, soon a quiet, observant boy who loved to draw. He could spend hours with a piece of paper and a pencil, lost in his own world of sketches. He was the most sensitive of the 4, the one who noticed the small details. The youngest was 5-year-old Tan Shin Ni. She was the only girl and the darling of the family. Her brothers doted on her, making sure she was never left out of their games. Chin Ni was just starting to find her own voice, and her laughter was often the soundtrack to the small apartment. These 4 children were a tight-knit team. They shared a bedroom, they shared their meals, and they shared a life that was defined by the simple, safe walls of their home in Block 58. The morning of January 6th began like every other morning for the past several years. Mei Ying woke up early, prepared a small breakfast for the children, and made sure they were awake. Because it was the school holidays for some, and others had different schedules, the 4 children were going to be home alone for just a short window of time. It was a routine they had followed many times before. Kok Peng was in charge, and Mei Ying knew she would be back in less than an hour. She left the apartment at 6:30. As she walked down the long open-air corridor toward the elevators, she could hear the muffled sounds of other families starting their days. She heard the clinking of dishes, the low murmur of morning news, and the distant hum of traffic. The air was humid and still the kind of heavy, tropical heat that promised a long, sweltering day. She climbed into her bus, adjusted her mirror, and pulled out into the street, her mind on the first stop. Between 6:30 and 7 to 10, Mei Ying was a woman on a mission. She moved through her route with practiced efficiency, picking up students and chatting briefly with their parents. She was a constant, reliable presence in their lives. She didn't notice anything unusual that morning. No strange cars followed her, no one lingered at her stops. The city felt as safe as it always did. She was just a mother working a job, unaware that the clock was ticking down on the world she knew. Back at the apartment, the 4 children were likely starting their own routine. They probably turned on the television or started a game in the living room. The door was locked, and they were taught never to open it for strangers. But in a place like Block 58, a stranger was a rare thing. People were used to neighbors dropping by, or the postman knocking, or a family friend stopping by to say hello. The children felt secure because they were in their own space. At 7 to 10, Mei Ying finished her route and headed back to Block 58. She was looking forward to having a quick cup of coffee with her children before starting her chores. She parked the bus, took the elevator up to the 6th floor, and walked down the familiar corridor. But as she approached her door, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The door was closed, but when she tried the handle, she realized it was locked from the outside. This was the first small deviation. Mei Ying always left the door locked from the inside so the children could open it when they heard her key. She fumbled with her own set of keys, her hands starting to shake slightly. She told herself that maybe Kok Peng had just been extra cautious and locked the deadbolt. She pushed the door open and stepped into the living room. The first thing she noticed wasn't a sound, but a complete and total silence that felt heavy and wrong. She called out their names. She called for Kok Peng, then for the others. There was no response. The television was off and the kitchen was empty. She walked toward the back of the small flat, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. She noticed a faint metallic smell in the air, something sharp and clean that didn't belong in a home. She followed the scent toward the bathroom, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She pushed the bathroom door open and the world ended. The 4 children were piled on top of one another in the small tiled space. They were still in their pajamas, their small bodies tangled together in a way that looked almost like they were sleeping if it weren't for the amount of blood that covered the floor and the walls. They had been attacked with a heavy, sharp blade, likely a meat chopper from a kitchen. The violence had been swift, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. Each child had been struck multiple times. Mei Ying's scream was heard throughout the entire block. Neighbors came running, and within minutes, the sixth-floor corridor was filled with people in a state of shock. The police arrived shortly after, but they were immediately faced with a crime scene that defied logic. There were no signs of a forced entry. The windows were intact, and the front door had been locked. This meant the children had let the killer into the apartment willingly. They had known their attacker. The investigation was one of the most intense in the history of Singapore. The police interviewed hundreds of people in Block 58 and the surrounding area. They looked for anyone who might have had a grudge against the Tan family, but they found nothing. Ku Enchai and Mei Ying were well-liked, hard-working people with no enemies. The motive for such a horrific crime against 4 innocent children seemed impossible to find. There was no robbery and no other signs of a motive. The police soon realized they were looking for someone who knew the family's schedule perfectly. They knew exactly when Mei Ying left and exactly when she would return. They knew the children would be home alone in that 40-minute window. Even more disturbing was a detail that emerged during the forensic examination. The killer had taken the time to arrange the bodies in a specific way, suggesting a level of cold, calculated cruelty that went beyond simple murder. But the most chilling piece of evidence didn't arrive until 2 weeks after the funeral. The Tan family was staying with relatives, unable to return to the apartment where their lives had been destroyed. They received a Chinese New Year greeting card in the mail. The front of the card showed happy children playing in a garden, but when they opened it, they found a message written in Chinese that turned their blood to ice. It mocked the family's tragedy in the most personal way possible. The message referred to the fact that Tan Quyen Chai had recently undergone a vasectomy. It said, and I quote, "Now you can have no more offspring." This one sentence changed everything. It proved that the killer wasn't just a random intruder or a local thief. It was someone who was intimately familiar with the family's private medical history. In 1979, a vasectomy was not something people talked about openly. It was a private matter known only to the parents and a very few close associates. The police pivoted their investigation to focus on friends, relatives, and close neighbors. They looked for anyone who might have been jealous of the family or who had a deep-seated resentment toward Quyen Chai or Mei Ying. They even brought in a neighbor who claimed to have seen a man he called Uncle walking in the corridor around the time of the murders. But the witness was a young child himself, and his testimony was inconsistent and difficult to verify. Despite the intensity of the search and the public outcry for justice, the case began to go cold. Every lead turned into a dead end. The weapon was never found, and no one ever came forward with a credible tip. The silence of Block 58 became a permanent fixture of the neighborhood. The Tans eventually moved away, trying to find a place where the memories wouldn't be so loud, but the mystery of who killed their children followed them for the rest of their lives. In the years that followed, the Geylang Bahru murders became a dark legend in Singapore. It was the case that ended the era of open doors and trusting neighbors. People started installing heavy iron gates and double locks on their HDB flats. The city was still modernizing, but it was also becoming more guarded, more suspicious of the people living just a few feet away. The tragedy of the Tan children was a reminder that the most dangerous person is often the one who knows you best. The apartment in Block 58 was eventually renovated and sold to new owners who had no connection to the tragedy. The building still stands today, a massive concrete monument to a different time. But for those who remember 1979, the sixth-floor corridor is still a place of ghosts. It is a place where 4 children once laughed and played, and where a 40-minute window of time was enough to erase an entire generation of a family. The only thing left is the memory of that greeting card, and the chilling knowledge that the killer was likely someone who sat at their table or walked beside them in the market. The case remains officially unsolved, a black hole in the justice system of a city that prided itself on order and safety. The silence of the bathroom in Block 58 is a heavy, suffocating thing, but it isn't the only place where a secret is buried beneath the surface of a quiet life. While Singapore was dealing with the aftermath of an insider threat, thousands of miles away in Italy, the hills of Tuscany were becoming a hunting ground for a different kind of shadow. Couples would drive out into the countryside to find a moment of peace under the stars, unaware that a meticulous, phantom-like killer was watching them from the tall grass, holding a Beretta pistol and a knife ready to turn a romantic evening into a ritual of absolute terror. In the late evening of September 14th, 1978, on a quiet, gravel-lined road in the rolling hills of Tuscany, Italy, two young people were sitting in a small car in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Antonio Migliorini, who was 24 years old, was the kind of person who worked hard all week and looked forward to the peace of the countryside. That night, he was just parked near the town of Signa, talking with his girlfriend. Antonio was a steady, quiet young man from a nearby village. He lived with his parents and worked at a local workshop, saving his money and planning for a future that seemed bright and predictable. He was the kind of son who always called home if he was going to be late. In a culture where family and tradition were the foundation of everything, Antonio was a pillar of his community. He was someone people trusted without question. His girlfriend was 25-year-old Maria Teresa Denuccio. She was a vibrant, hard-working woman who worked in a local factory. She was known for her quick wit and her deep loyalty to her friends. To Maria Teresa, these weekend drives into the hills were a chance to escape the noise of the city and the watchful eyes of their tight-knit families. She and Antonio were deeply in love, and these quiet moments in the car were where they built their dreams. To understand why they were parked on that lonely road, you have to understand the culture of Italy in the 1970s. For young couples who still lived at home, privacy was a rare and precious commodity. This led to the rise of what the locals called lovers' lanes. These were secluded spots in the hills where hundreds of couples would park every night. It was a social institution, a place where the young felt safe because there were always other people nearby. Antonio and Maria Teresa had a favorite spot near a small bridge. It was a place where the air smelled of dry grass and wild lavender. On that Thursday night, the moon was nearly full, casting a soft silver glow over the vineyards. They felt completely alone, yet surrounded by the familiar comfort of the Tuscan night. They were just two young people sharing a cigarette and a conversation, unaware that they had been chosen by a ghost. The first small deviation occurred when Antonio noticed a movement in the tall grass near the passenger side of the car. At first, he likely thought it was just a stray dog or a small animal moving through the brush. He didn't feel a surge of panic. He felt a minor irritation that their privacy was being interrupted. He reached for the keys to start the engine, thinking it was time to move to another spot further up the hillside. But the movement wasn't an animal. A figure stepped out of the darkness, holding a Beretta Series 70 pistol. The trigger event happened in a flash of suppressed gunfire. The killer didn't say a word. He didn't ask for money. He just fired several rounds through the window with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Antonio and Maria Teresa never had a chance to speak or defend themselves. The silence of the hills returned almost instantly. The discovery was made early the next morning by a local farmer who was heading out to check his vines. He saw the small car parked at an odd angle near the bridge, its windows shattered and glittering in the morning sun. When he looked inside, he ran to the nearest house to call the carabinieri. The scene was unlike anything the local police had ever seen. It wasn't just a murder. It was a ritualistic display of absolute coldness. The investigation immediately hit a wall of terrifying consistency. Forensic experts found several shell casings on the ground. They were marked with a small letter H on the base, indicating they were Winchester long rifle rounds. When the ballistic reports came back, the investigators realized they were dealing with something impossible. The gun used to kill Antonio and Maria Teresa was the exact same weapon used in a double murder 10 years earlier. This was the point of no return for the city of Florence. The realization that a killer had been sitting on a weapon for a decade, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again, sent a wave of terror through the region. The police began to look at the 1968 case, which had been written off as a crime of passion. They realized the man they had imprisoned for that crime might have been innocent, and the real monster was still out there. As the weeks went by, the pressure on the authorities became unbearable. The killer, who the media began calling the Monster of Florence, had left no fingerprints and no DNA. He was a shadow who understood the geography of the hills better than the police. He knew exactly where the couples would be, and he knew how to approach them without making a sound. He was a predator who had turned the most romantic landscape in the world into a slaughterhouse. The most defining clue was the surgical precision found at the scene. The killer hadn't just shot the victims. He had used a sharp, heavy knife to remove a specific piece of Maria Teresa's clothing and a portion of her anatomy. The cuts were so clean and accurate that investigators believed they were looking for someone with medical training or experience as a butcher. This detail changed the entire profile of the case from a random shooting to a targeted ritualistic obsession. Years later, the investigation would lead to a group of local men known as the Companions of Snack. These were social outcasts who spent their nights drinking and wandering the hills. One man, Pietro Pacciani, became the primary suspect. He was a man with a violent past and a deep resentment toward women, but the evidence against him was largely circumstantial, and the case was plagued by conspiracy theories involving high society cults and professional hitmen. The monster of Florence was never truly stopped by the law. The murders continued until 1985, always using the same Beretta and the same Winchester ammunition. Pacciani died in his home before a definitive retrial could be held, and the gun was never recovered. The case remains a partial failure of the Italian justice system, a mystery that has inspired dozens of books and movies, but has never provided closure for the families. The smell of lavender and dry grass in the Tuscan hills still carries a sharp, metallic scent for those who remember 1978. The lovers' lanes are quieter now, and the gravel roads are often empty after dark. The monster might be gone, but the silence he left behind is a permanent scar on the landscape. It is a reminder that some shadows don't just fade away. They wait for decades hidden in the tall grass, holding a secret that never quite stays buried. But while Italy was searching for a ghost in the hills, another kind of darkness was unfolding in the cold, sterile interior of a bank in Osaka, Japan. On a Friday afternoon in early 1979, a man in a suit walked through the glass doors carrying a double-barreled shotgun. He didn't want the money in the vault. He wanted to turn a public space into a private prison, forcing dozens of ordinary people to participate in his own slow descent into madness. At 2 o'clock on the afternoon of January 26, 1979, in the bustling financial district of Osaka, Japan, a 47-year-old bank manager named Kunio Morioka was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Morioka was the kind of person who lived by a code of absolute precision and quiet dignity. That Friday, he was just reviewing the midday transaction logs and ensuring that the service at the Mitsubishi Bank was as seamless and polite as it was every other day of the week. Morioka was a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the institution. In the world of Japanese banking in the late 1970s, a position like his was not just a job. It was a matter of honor. He wore a perfectly pressed suit every single morning, his white shirt starched to a crisp edge, and his shoes polished until they reflected the fluorescent lights of the lobby. He believed that the bank was the heart of the community, a place where people brought their life savings and their trust, and he treated every yen with the same level of respect. The Kitahama branch of the Mitsubishi Bank was a temple of order. The counters were made of polished marble, and the air always smelled faintly of ink, paper, and floor wax. The tellers moved with a synchronized grace, bowing slightly to each customer, and counting out bills with a rhythmic snap that Morioka found deeply comforting. There was a sense of safety in that building that felt impenetrable. It was a space defined by rules where everyone knew their role, and the world outside the glass doors felt chaotic and distant. Kunio Morioka took great pride in his staff. He knew the names of their children and the details of their hobbies. He was the kind of manager who would stay late to help a junior clerk balance their drawer if they were off by even a few yen. He fostered an environment of mutual support where the success of the branch was a collective victory. To Morioka, the bank was a fortress of stability in a society that was rapidly modernizing. He believed that as long as they followed the protocols, nothing could ever truly go wrong within those four walls. One of the young tellers, a woman named Akiko, was particularly close to Morioka. She had only been at the branch for a year, but she had already adopted his sense of discipline. That afternoon, she was assisting a regular customer, an elderly man who came in every Friday to deposit his pension. Morioka watched them from his glass-walled office, a small smile of satisfaction on his face. He watched the way the sunlight hit the brass fixtures, and the way the quiet murmur of business filled the room. It was the perfect picture of a successful, orderly day. Outside the bank, the streets of Osaka were a blur of motion. The city was a sprawling industrial giant filled with the sound of train whistles and the rush of thousands of commuters. But inside the Kitahama branch, time seemed to move slower. The staff focused on the small tactile details of their work, the feel of the thick ledger paper, the sound of the stamping machines, and the polite exchanges with the customers. This was the world Morioka had built, a world where every action had a clear purpose and every person was exactly where they belonged. Morioka spent the early afternoon preparing for the weekend closing. He checked the security of the vaults and ensured the alarm systems were functional. He wasn't a man who worried, but he was a man who planned. He understood that his responsibility extended beyond the money. It was about the people under his care. He felt a deep sense of calm as the clock ticked toward 3 o'clock, the traditional closing time. He expected the day to end, as it always did, with a final bow and the locking of the front doors. The first small deviation occurred when a man in his early 30s walked through the main entrance. He was wearing a dark, oversized suit and carrying a large, heavy bag. He didn't look like a customer, but he didn't look like a threat either. He moved with a strange, jittery energy that was completely at odds with the stillness of the bank. Morioka noticed him immediately from across the lobby. The man didn't go to a teller window. He simply stood in the center of the room, looking at the ceiling as if he were trying to remember something important. The man was Aoshiki Umekawa. To the staff at the bank, he was a total stranger, but to the legal system in Japan, he was a ghost. When he was only 15 years old, Umekawa had committed a brutal murder, but because of his age, he had been released into society after only a few years of rehabilitation. He was a man who felt the world owed him a stage, a person who believed that his internal darkness was a form of genius. He had spent months planning a confrontation that would force the entire country to look at him. The trigger event happened with a sudden, deafening violence. Umekawa reached into his bag and pulled out a double-barreled shotgun. He didn't scream for money. He didn't point at the safe. He simply fired a blast into the ceiling, the sound echoing like a bomb in the sterile lobby. The smell of gunpowder instantly replaced the scent of ink and wax. Morioka stepped out of his office, his hands raised, his mind trying to process the violation of the space he had spent his life protecting. He saw Umekawa's eyes, and he realized he wasn't looking at a robber. Rising pressure began to mount as Umekawa took control of the 30-plus people inside the building. He ordered everyone to drop to the floor, his voice high and erratic. When 2 police officers happened to enter the bank on a routine check, Umekawa didn't hesitate. He shot them both where they stood. Then he turned his attention back to the bank staff. He ordered the men to move to one side and the women to the other. He began to issue a series of bizarre psychological demands that were designed to strip away the dignity of his captives. The point of no return came when Umekawa realized the police were surrounding the building. He knew he wasn't going to leave the bank alive, and he decided that his final act would be a slow-motion descent into madness. He forced the bank manager Morioka to act as his messenger, relaying his erratic thoughts to the negotiators outside. But then his behavior turned even more disturbing. He ordered the bank employees to strip naked. He told them that this was to prevent them from hiding weapons or attempting to escape, but the staff knew the truth. He wanted to humiliate them. He wanted to break the very culture of respect and order that Morioka had worked so hard to build. For the next 42 hours, the Mitsubishi Bank became a private prison. Umekawa forced the hostages to form human shields in front of the large windows, their bare skin pressed against the cold glass. He would sit in a chair in the center of the room, the shotgun resting on his lap, and talk for hours about his philosophy of life and death. He would swing between moments of eerie calm and sudden explosive rage. Morioka watched in horror as his staff was subjected to this psychological torture. He tried to speak to Umekawa to appeal to his humanity, but he found there was nothing there to reach. Umekawa seemed to enjoy the absolute power he held over their lives. He would force the tellers to perform menial tasks or stand in specific formations, just to prove he could make them do it. The heat in the bank began to rise as the ventilation system was shut down, and the smell of fear and sweat became overwhelming. The standoff stretched through the first night and into the second day. The eyes of the entire nation were fixed on the bank. Outside, the Osaka police SAT, known as the Zero Squad, was preparing for a tactical intervention that had almost no precedent in Japanese history. They were practicing their movements in a replica of the lobby, timing their entries to the millisecond. They knew that Umakawa was highly armed and completely unpredictable. They also knew that every hour that passed increased the likelihood that he would begin executing the hostages. Inside, the situation was reaching a breaking point. Umakawa had already killed 4 people, including 2 bank employees who had tried to resist him. He began to talk more and more about the end. He told the hostages that they were all going to die together in a grand finale. He forced them to sing songs and thank him for the lessons he was teaching them. Morioka stayed near his staff, offering whispered words of encouragement whenever Umakawa looked away. He was determined to be the last one standing to maintain the dignity of his role until the very end. The climax happened at dawn on the 3rd day. The Zero Squad received the order to move. They used specialized explosives to breach the side entrances and the roof simultaneously. The sound of the explosions was followed by a flash of light that blinded everyone in the lobby. Umakawa scrambled for his shotgun, but the snipers had already found their mark. 3 shots rang out in quick succession, and the man who had turned a bank into a theater of cruelty collapsed onto the marble floor he had spent 2 days defiling. The aftermath was a scene of total exhaustion. The hostages were let out into the morning air, wrapped in blankets and shielded from the cameras by the police. Morioka was one of the last to leave. He walked through the lobby, stepping over the shattered glass and the discarded shell casings. He looked at his office, the glass now riddled with bullet holes, and he realized that the world he had known was gone. The bank would be cleaned, and the marble would be polished, but the sense of absolute safety had been permanently erased. Umakawa's death ended the crisis, but it launched a national debate about the laws surrounding juvenile offenders and the psychological toll of such extreme events. The Mitsubishi Bank hostage crisis became a turning point in Japanese law enforcement, leading to the creation of more specialized tactical units and a complete overhaul of bank security protocols. But for the people who were inside, the legacy was much more personal. They were forever the ones who had been forced to stand naked in the window watching the world watch them. Kunio Morioka eventually returned to work, but he was never the same man. He still wore his pressed suits and starched shirts, but the quiet satisfaction he had once found in the routine was gone. He looked at the glass doors of the bank not as a shield, but as a fragile barrier. He had learned that even the most orderly life can be dismantled in a matter of seconds by a person who has nothing to lose. The memory of the shotgun's blast would stay with him every time a stranger walked through the door. The ringing of a desk phone that Umakawa refused to answer for 42 hours continued to echo through the silent, terrified bank in Morioka's dreams for years. It was a sound that signaled a total breakdown of communication, a moment where logic and order were replaced by the whim of a single broken mind. The Kitahama branch was eventually remodeled, its marble replaced, and its layout changed, but the history of those 3 days was baked into the very foundation of the building. The story of the Mitsubishi Bank is a story about the limits of human resilience and the high cost of a single person's madness. It is a reminder that even in a society built on tradition and respect, the shadows can still find a way in. The sterile interior of the bank had been turned into a prison, and although the prisoners were eventually freed, they would always carry the weight of that silence with them. The cold, bright light of the Osaka morning was the only thing that could finally wash away the darkness. But as the people of Osaka were trying to forget the image of the man with the shotgun, another kind of silence was settling over a small street in Manhattan. Thousands of miles away, a 6-year-old boy was putting on his favorite captain's hat and getting ready for the biggest adventure of his life. He was going to walk to the bus stop all by himself for the very first time, a simple 2-block journey that was supposed to be a milestone of his independence. At 8 o'clock on the morning of May 25th, 1979, in the Soho neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, a 6-year-old boy named Etan Patz was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Etan was the kind of person who was eager to prove he could be responsible and grown up. That morning, he was just putting on a blue captain's hat and checking to make sure he had a single dollar bill tucked safely into his pocket. Etan was a child whose smile seemed to take up most of his face. He was bright, energetic, and had a mop of blonde hair that was usually a bit messy. He lived with his parents Stan and Julie and his 2 siblings in a large industrial loft on Prince Street. In 1979, Soho wasn't the high-end shopping district it is today. It was a neighborhood of artists and craftsmen, where the cobblestone streets were still gritty and the air smelled of diesel exhaust and old wood. The Pats family lived on the second floor of a cast-iron building. Their loft was filled with the tools of their trades. Stan was a professional photographer, and Julie ran a small daycare center out of their home. Eitan grew up surrounded by creativity and other children. He was the kind of kid who knew the name of every dog in the building and always had a question for the mailman. He was helpful, social, and possessed a natural confidence that made people gravitate toward him. His parents were careful, but they were also part of a community that believed in letting children find their own footing. Eitan had been begging them for weeks to let him walk the 2 blocks to the school bus stop by himself. He wanted to feel the independence of a big kid to navigate the sidewalks without a hand to hold. To him, those 2 blocks were a vast and exciting frontier. He had practiced the route with his mother many times, pointing out the cracks in the sidewalk and the storefronts along the way. The morning was particularly beautiful. The spring air was crisp, and the morning sun was just beginning to hit the tops of the brick buildings. Stan and Julie had finally agreed that today would be the day. It was a milestone, a small but significant step in Eitan's journey toward growing up. They gave him $1 to buy a soda at the bodega on the corner, a little reward for his bravery. Julie watched from the loft window as her son stepped out onto the sidewalk, his small frame looking even smaller against the massive industrial doors. She watched him walk toward the corner of Prince Street and West Broadway. He was wearing a blue parka, blue corduroy pants, and those distinctive sneakers with the lightning bolts on the side. He didn't look back. He was focused on his mission, his hand likely resting on that dollar bill. Julie felt a mix of pride and a mother's natural anxiety, but she trusted her son and she trusted the neighborhood. In their world, everyone looked out for one another. She turned away from the window to continue with her morning chores. The walk was supposed to take less than 5 minutes. It was a straight line past a few galleries, a textile warehouse, and a small corner store. At the end of the second block, the yellow school bus would pull up the doors, would hiss open, and Eitan would climb the steps to join his friends. The bus driver was a regular on the route, and knew all the children by name. It was a closed loop of safety, a routine that had been repeated by thousands of families across the city that morning. But when the school day ended and the bus returned to Soho at 3:30 that afternoon, Eitan was not on it. Julie was waiting at the stop, her eyes scanning the small group of children as they hopped down onto the pavement. She asked the driver where Eitan was, thinking perhaps he had stayed late for a project or had gone home with a friend. The driver looked at her with a confused expression. He told her that Eitan had never boarded the bus that morning. He hadn't seen the boy at the stop at all. This was the first small deviation that turned into a waking nightmare. Julie ran back to the loft, her heart hammering against her ribs. She called the school hoping there had been a misunderstanding. The secretary confirmed that Eitan had been marked absent. Julie then began calling every parent she knew, her voice rising in pitch with every no she received. By the time Stan returned home a short time later, the realization had set in. Their son hadn't just missed the bus. He had vanished in the 2 blocks between their front door and the corner. The police response was immediate and massive. Because Eitan was so young and the disappearance was so sudden, the NYPD launched one of the most intensive searches in the history of New York City. They went door to door through every building in Soho. They searched the rooftops, the basements, the elevator shafts, and the industrial trash compactors. Thousands of volunteers joined the effort, handing out flyers with Eitan's picture. His face with that wide, gap-toothed smile was suddenly everywhere, on every telephone pole and in every shop window. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on the family and the investigators became almost unbearable. There were no witnesses who had seen Eitan being taken. No one heard a struggle or a cry for help. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the gray air of the city. Stan used his skills as a photographer to create a high-quality portrait of his son, which became the definitive image of the search. This was the first time a missing child's face was broadcast so widely, and it tapped into a collective fear that gripped the entire nation. The case changed the way America handled missing children forever. Before Eitan, there was no central database for missing kids, and police departments rarely shared information across state lines. The search for Eitan led to the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. His birthday, May 25th, was eventually named National Missing Children's Day by President Ronald Reagan. Eitan was also the very first child to ever have his photograph printed on the side of a milk carton, a practice that would soon become a staple of American life in the 1980s. Despite the fame of the case, the years stretched on without a single credible lead. Stan and Julie Patz made a heartbreaking decision. They refused to move out of their loft on Prince Street. They didn't change their phone number for over 30 years. They lived in the same space where Eitan had played with his blocks, hoping that one day the phone would ring or there would be a knock on the door. They became symbols of a parent's unbreakable hope, even as the neighborhood around them transformed from an industrial wasteland into a playground for the wealthy. Over the decades, several suspects emerged. One man, a convicted child molester who had been a friend of a former babysitter, was the primary focus of the FBI for years. They even dug up a basement in Soho in 2012, hoping to find any trace of Eitan's clothing or remains. But the search came up empty. The investigation seemed destined to remain a cold case, a permanent scar on the history of the city, until a tip came in from a completely unexpected source. The man's name was Pedro Hernandez. In 1979, he had been an 18-year-old clerk working at a small bodega right on the corner where Eitan was supposed to catch his bus. After the disappearance, Hernandez had moved back to New Jersey and started a family. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life for over 30 years. But he carried a secret that had slowly eaten away at his conscience. He had told a few family members and members of his church group that he had done a bad thing in New York, but no one had ever gone to the authorities. Finally, in 2012, his brother-in-law called the police. When investigators sat down with Pedro Hernandez, they found a man who seemed almost relieved to finally speak. He confessed that on that May morning, he had seen Eitan walking toward the bus stop. He had lured the boy into the basement of the bodega by promising him a soda. Once they were alone in the dark, cramped space, he had strangled the child. He then placed the small body into a cardboard box and left it with the trash on a nearby street. Hernandez claimed he didn't have a reason. He said it was just an impulse, a moment of darkness that had seized him. Because the city's trash was collected so quickly in those days, Eitan's body was likely taken to a landfill long before the police even realized he was missing. There was no physical evidence left to find. The bodega had been renovated, and the basement had been cleared out dozens of times. The only thing the prosecution had was the confession and the intimate details that only the killer could have known. After a grueling trial and a deadlocked jury in the first round, Pedro Hernandez was eventually convicted of murder and kidnapping in 2017. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. For Stan and Julie, the conviction brought a form of legal closure, but it didn't bring their son back. They still lived in the loft on Prince Street, surrounded by the ghosts of a morning that had started with a blue captain's hat and a dollar bill. They had finally learned the truth, but the truth was just as empty as the silence that had followed the bus. The legacy of Eitan Patz is written into the laws of the country and the habits of every parent who holds their child's hand a little tighter in a crowd. He was the boy who made the world realize that even a 2-block walk can be a journey of no return. The grainy black and white photos on the milk cartons have faded, and the Soho of 1979 has been paved over by the modern world, but the image of Eitan smiling in his hat remains a permanent fixture of the American consciousness. The sound of a single dollar bill crinkling in a child's pocket is a quiet thing, but in the silence of that Prince Street loft, it is a sound that has never stopped echoing. It was the price of a soda that was never bought, and a future that was taken in a basement before the school bus even arrived. The case is solved, but the weight of those 2 missing blocks remains a heavy reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn into the unthinkable. But while New York was grappling with a loss that changed the nation, a detective in a quiet suburb of Chicago was about to follow his own intuition into a much darker place. Just a few months before Eitan disappeared, a high school student had gone missing after a job interview, leading the police to the doorstep of a well-liked man who spent his weekends dressing up as a clown for neighborhood parties. Beneath the floorboards of that man's house, a secret was waiting that would redefine the meaning of a mass grave. On the evening of December 11th, 1978, in the brightly lit aisles of a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois, a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest was in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. Robert was the kind of teenager who was always looking for the next step, a kid who wanted to work hard and earn enough money to feel independent. That night he was just finishing his shift, waiting for his mother to pick him up so they could go home and celebrate his sister's birthday. Robert was a popular, well-liked student at Maine West High School. He was a gymnast, a boy with a lean, athletic build and a disciplined mind. His coworkers at the pharmacy described him as the kind of employee every manager wants: someone who showed up early, stayed late, and never complained about the boring tasks. He had a bright future ahead of him, and he was already planning his next move. He had heard that a local contractor was in the store, and he wanted to ask the man about a higher-paying construction job for the holiday break. His mother, Elizabeth Piest, was sitting in her car in the parking lot, watching the snow fall against the windshield. She saw her son through the large glass windows of the store, talking to a husky, middle-aged man in a suit. Robert looked excited, nodding his head as the man spoke. A few minutes later, Robert stepped out of the pharmacy and leaned into his mother's car window. He told her that the contractor wanted to talk to him about a job and that he would be right back. He just needed to step over to the man's truck for a moment. Elizabeth watched as her son walked back toward the building. She waited. 5 minutes turned into 15. 15 minutes turned into 30. The pharmacy closed its doors. The lights inside were dimmed and the parking lot began to empty. But Robert never came back to the car. This was the first small deviation that would eventually lead to the discovery of one of the most horrific secrets in the history of the United States. Robert Piest hadn't just walked away. He had stepped into the orbit of a man who was the perfect mask of suburban normalcy. To understand how Robert Piest could vanish from a busy parking lot, you have to understand the man he went to talk to. John Wayne Gacy was 46 years old, and to the people of Des Plaines, he was the definition of a success story. He was a self-made man who owned a thriving construction business called PDM Contractors. Gacy was the kind of person who was always busy, always involved, and always making sure everyone knew how much he contributed to the community. He lived in a modest but well-maintained ranch-style house on Summerdale Avenue. His yard was perfectly manicured, and he was known for throwing massive summer parties where he would grill hundreds of pounds of meat for his neighbors and local politicians. Gacy was deeply involved in the local Democratic Party, serving as a precinct captain. He had even been photographed with the First Lady Rosalind Carter just a few years earlier. He was a man with connections, a man who shook hands with the police and the mayor. But there was another side to John Wayne Gacy that the neighbors found charming. On the weekends, he would transform into Pogo the Clown. He would put on a colorful suit, paint a bright red smile on his face, and perform at children's hospitals and neighborhood block parties. He told everyone he did it because he loved to see children laugh, and he became a fixture of local charity events. To the world, Gacy was a pillar of the community, a hard-working businessman with a heart of gold. Gacy's public persona was built on a foundation of absolute control. He was a man who knew how to manipulate the way people saw him. He was boisterous, often loud, and possessed a level of confidence that made people trust him instinctively. If you needed a kitchen remodeled or a basement finished, you called Gacy. He was reliable, he was professional, and he was one of them. He was a man who lived the American dream, or at least that was the story he told everyone who would listen. Inside his home, Gacy lived a life that was surprisingly conventional on the surface. He had been married twice, though both marriages had ended in divorce. He was a man who valued his privacy, but he wasn't a hermit. He often had young men working for him, many of them high school students or drifters looking for a quick paycheck. He told his neighbors that he liked to give young people a chance to learn a trade and build a future. It was just another example of his legendary generosity. The logic of the tragedy was built on this foundation of trust. Because Gacy was so well regarded, no one questioned why so many young men were seen entering his house and never leaving. No one questioned the odd smells that sometimes drifted from his property during the humid Illinois summers. Gacy always had an answer. He said the smell was the result of a moisture problem in his crawl space, or a broken sewer pipe that he was planning to fix. He was a contractor after all. If anyone knew how to fix a house, it was him. This profile of a model citizen was so effective that when Detective Joseph Kozenchak of the Des Plaines Police Department first started looking into Robert Piest's disappearance, he didn't immediately suspect Gacy of anything, more than being the last person to see the boy. But Kozenchak was a man who trusted his instincts. He went to Gacy's house to ask a few routine questions, and he noticed something that didn't sit right with him. Gacy was a bit too helpful, a bit too eager to explain away the encounter at the pharmacy. Gacy told the detective that he had spoken to Robert, but that the boy had never actually shown up at his truck for the job interview. He suggested that maybe Robert had run away, or that he was involved with a bad crowd. It was a standard story, but Gacy's delivery was off. He was too polished, too rehearsed. Kozenjak decided to run a background check on the successful contractor, and what he found was the trigger event for the entire investigation. He discovered that 10 years earlier, in 1968, Gacy had been convicted of a sexual assault in Iowa and had served time in prison. This information hit the detective like a physical blow. The model citizen, the precinct captain, the man who performed as a clown for sick children, was a convicted felon. Kozenjak knew he had to move fast. He secured a search warrant for Gacy's house on Somerdale Avenue, but he didn't realize that he was about to walk into a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first time the police entered the house, they were struck by a smell. It wasn't the smell of a dirty kitchen or a damp basement. It was something much more visceral. It was a faint, sweet scent of decay, the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat and stays there. Gacy was calm, almost arrogant, as he led the officers through his home. He pointed to the floor vents and repeated his story about the sewer problems. He even offered the officers coffee while they searched his belongings. The rising pressure of the investigation began to take a toll on Gacy's composure. The police placed him under 24-hour surveillance, following him every time he left his house. Gacy tried to play games with the officers, leading them on high-speed chases, and even inviting them into a restaurant to eat dinner with him. He seemed to enjoy the attention, behaving as if the whole thing were a grand performance, and he was the star. But the detectives weren't playing. They were waiting for a single mistake. The point of no return came during a second search of the house. Detective Kozenjak and his team were focusing on the bathroom and the laundry room. They noticed that the smell of decay was strongest, near a small trapdoor in the floor of a closet. The door led to a crawl space beneath the house, a dark, cramped area with a dirt floor and a very low ceiling. One of the officers noticed that the dirt in the crawl space didn't look right. It was matted down in some places and freshly turned in others. On December 21st, 1978, the police began a manual excavation of the crawl space. Because the ceiling was so low, the officers had to work on their hands and knees using small hand shovels and even their bare hands to move the earth. The air was thick with the smell of lime and rot. The temperature inside the house was warm, but the crawl space felt like a tomb. As they cleared away the first few inches of soil, they found a human bone. Then another, and then another. Gacy was taken into custody, and as the scale of the discovery began to emerge, his mask finally shattered. He realized that the evidence was overwhelming, and he began to talk. He told his lawyers, and later the police, that he had killed 33 young men and boys over the course of 6 years. He explained how he would lure them to his house, with the promise of work, or by posing as a police officer. He would show them a handcuff trick, and once they were restrained, he would murder them. The discovery and first response was a scene of absolute horror for the community. For the next several weeks, the quiet street on Somerdale Avenue was transformed into a massive forensic site. The police had to literally dismantle the house to get to the bodies. They found 29 victims buried in the mud and lime beneath the floorboards. The bodies were stacked on top of one another, packed so tightly that the investigators had to use specialized equipment to separate the remains without damaging the evidence. The work was physically and psychologically exhausting for the officers. They were working in a space that was only a few feet high, surrounded by the physical evidence of a monster's obsession. They found pieces of clothing, wallets, and high school rings. They realized that Gacy had been living in that house, eating his meals and entertaining his neighbors, while the bodies of dozens of young men were rotting just a few inches beneath his feet. It was a level of depravity that the quiet suburb of Des Plaines could not comprehend. The investigation into the aftermath of the discovery was a massive undertaking. The police had to identify 33 victims, many of whom had been missing for years. They used dental records, x-rays, and the help of grieving families who had been searching for their sons since the early 1970s. They found that Gacy had targeted the vulnerable runaways, hitchhikers, and young men looking for a better life. But he had also taken boys like Robert Piest, kids with families and futures who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. A redefining clue emerged during the search of Gacy's office. The police found a receipt for a film developing service that matched a roll of film Robert Piest had dropped off before he vanished. This physical link to the victim proved that Robert had indeed been in Gacy's company. It was the piece of evidence that sealed Gacy's fate. Despite his attempts to claim insanity during his trial, the jury saw the meticulous planning and the cold, calculated nature of his crimes. He was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The climax of the case was the trial, which began in early 1980. The prosecution presented the evidence of the crawl space, the testimony of the officers, and the harrowing details of the confessions. The world watched in shock as the image of Pogo the Clown was replaced by the reality of a serial killer. Gacy was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. He spent the next 14 years on death row, continuing to play games with the legal system until his execution in 1994. The final tightening before the end was the realization that Gacy had disposed of the final 4 victims in the Des Plaines River because he had literally run out of room in his crawl space. This included Robert Piest. Robert's body was eventually recovered from the river months after the search began. He was the final victim, the one whose disappearance had finally brought the house of cards down. If it hadn't been for Robert's mother waiting in that car, Gacy might have continued his spree for years. The truth revealed by the Gacy case changed the way the public looked at their neighbors. It destroyed the illusion that the suburbs were a safe haven from the darkness of the world. It showed that a person could be a leader, a friend, and a clown while carrying a secret that was more terrifying than any ghost story. The names of the 33 victims are now etched into the history of Illinois, a reminder of the lives that were stolen by a man who used a smile as a weapon. Today, the house on Summerdale Avenue is gone. It was torn down shortly after the investigation ended, and for a long time the lot stood empty. A new house was eventually built on the site, and the street has returned to its quiet suburban routine. But the ground beneath the floorboards is something the neighbors will never forget. The silence of the crawl space was broken by the truth, but the weight of what was found there continues to linger in the cold Illinois air. The only thing left is the memory of a 15-year-old boy who just wanted a job for the holidays. Robert Piest went to talk to a contractor in a pharmacy parking lot, believing he was taking a step toward his future. He didn't know that the man in the suit was the end of the line. The final truth of the Gacy case isn't found in the trial or the execution. It's found in the heat of the floor vents, where the scent of a secret was enough to stop a monster. The house is empty, the clown suit is in an evidence locker, and the mud in the crawl space has long since settled. But the silence of 1978 is a heavy, permanent thing. It's the sound of a mother waiting in a car for a son who is never coming back. It's the final detail of a decade that started with the promise of progress and ended with a discovery that proved the most dangerous place in the world is the one where you feel the safest. We have walked through a very specific window of time together tonight. The years 1978 and 1979 were more than just dates on a digital calendar. They were a bridge between an old world that believed in a certain kind of predictable safety and a new world where that safety was revealed to be a thin coat of paint. You can feel it in the air of these stories, a cooling of the spirit that hasn't quite warmed up yet. When you look up at the stars tonight, you might remember Frederick Valentich and his small Cessna. His story reminds us that there are still limits to what our instruments can tell us about the universe. We like to think we have mapped the world and mastered the physics of flight, but sometimes the sky just opens up and takes what it wants. It leaves us with a sense that we are guests in a space far larger and more indifferent than we care to admit. Then there is the silence of those dusty alleys in Jaipur. It is a reminder that evil doesn't always need a grand motive or a complex plan to leave a mark. Sometimes it is just a man with a hammer and a need to be heard. It forces us to look at the people we pass every day in a different light. The invisible people, the ones we ignore, are often the ones who are paying the closest attention to our routines, waiting for the one moment when we forget to look back. The rainy pavement of Waterloo Bridge teaches us a different lesson about the lethality of politeness. Georgi Markov's life was taken by an apology and an umbrella. It is a chilling thought that the very social graces we use to keep the world running can be turned into a weapon. It leaves you wondering about the small stings and minor bumps of daily life, and how much trust we place in the strangers who share our sidewalks and our morning commutes. The bright fluorescent glow of the burger chef in Indiana was supposed to be a beacon of suburban normalcy, but that story reminds us that even the most well-lit places can be swallowed by the dark. When those 4 young people walked out of that kitchen, they took the innocence of an entire town with them. It is a story that stays with you because it highlights how easily the routine of a Friday night shift can dissolve into a tragedy that lasts for 50 years. The Sarah Joe is a story that defies the logic of time and distance. It leaves us with the image of a boat drifting through a decade of silence, only to wash up on a beach 2,000 miles away. It reminds us that nature doesn't care about our schedules or our unsinkable hulls. There is a specific kind of loneliness in the thought of that shallow grave on an uninhabited atoll, a sense that some journeys end in places that aren't even on the map. In the frozen woods of the Plumas National Forest, the Yuba County Five showed us that the mind can be its own trap. The most terrifying part of that story isn't the cold or the darkness, but the mystery of why 5 men couldn't reach for the food and heat that was right in front of them. It leaves you carrying the weight of their confusion, a reminder that our perception of the world is a fragile thing that can be shattered by a single wrong turn in the snow. The Geylang Bahru murders in Singapore brought the horror even closer to home. It proved that the most dangerous person in the world isn't always a stranger in the woods. Sometimes it is the person who knows your medical history and your children's names. That story leaves a bitter taste, because it highlights the vulnerability of the domestic space. It reminds us that when we lock our doors, we are also locking ourselves in with our secrets and our neighbors. The hills of Tuscany were supposed to be a place of romance, but the monster of Florence turned them into a ritual site. That story leaves us with the scent of lavender and the sharp metallic tang of gunpowder. It reminds us that some monsters are meticulous and patient, willing to wait for years for the perfect moment to strike. It is a story about the persistence of evil and the way a single gun can hold a whole region in a state of siege for nearly 2 decades. The Mitsubishi Bank crisis in Osaka showed us that power is often just a performance. Aoshiki Umekawa used a shotgun to turn a public space into a private theater of cruelty. It leaves you thinking about the fragility of the systems we rely on, our banks, our police, our sense of order. When that order is stripped away, we are left with nothing but our own resilience and the quiet dignity of people like Kunio Morioka who refuse to let the darkness win. Eton Patz's story is perhaps the heaviest one to carry away. It is the story of 2 blocks that stretched out into an entire lifetime of loss. It changed the way an entire nation looked at its children and its streets. When you think of Eton, you think of the first day of independence that turned into a permanent disappearance. It is a reminder that the smallest distance can be the most dangerous, and that some phone calls will never be answered. Finally, we are left with the crawlspace of John Wayne Gacy. It is the ultimate story of the neighbor who was too good to be true. Gacy used a smile and a clown suit to mask a void that was deeper than anyone could have imagined. It leaves us with the lesson that the people who work the hardest to be seen as pillars of the community are sometimes the ones who have the most to hide. It is a story about the danger of the mask and the silence of the mud. Taking these stories with you tonight isn't about being afraid of the dark. It's about understanding the value of the light. Each of these tragedies reminds us that the ordinary life we lead is a precious, fragile thing. We carry these stories as a form of respect for the people who didn't get to finish their journeys. We remember their names and their routines, because they are the ones who paid the price for our understanding of the world's hidden edges. These 11 cases from 1978 and 1979 were a turning point in human history. They led to new laws, new forensic techniques, and a new way of protecting our children. But they also left us with a deeper awareness of the complexity of the human heart. We learned that the world is a place where a 19-year-old pilot can vanish into the sky and a 6-year-old boy can disappear on a sidewalk. It is a world of both wonder and horror. The lesson of these stories is one of vigilance, but also one of empathy. When we hear about the struggle of the families or the dedication of the investigators, we are reminded of the best parts of ourselves. We are the ones who keep the search going. We are the ones who refuse to let the cases go cold. By carrying these stories with us, we ensure that the victims are never truly forgotten and that the silence of the past is always being challenged by the truth. I want to thank you for staying with me through these accounts. It isn't easy to look into the crawlspace or the dark woods, but it is necessary. These stories are a part of our shared history, a record of the moments when the unthinkable became real. I hope you carry away a sense of the value of your own routine and the safety of your own home tonight. The world is a strange place, and we are all just trying to find our way back to the light. If you found value in these stories, I'd appreciate it if you took a moment to let me know. Leave a comment about which case resonated with you the most, or simply tap that like button to show your support. It helps me know that you are out there and that these accounts are finding the right ears. We have many more stories to tell, and I'm glad we can explore these darker corners of history together. It's always better to walk through the shadows with a friend. Before you go, take a deep breath and look around you. Appreciate the solid floor beneath your feet and the roof over your head. Remember the names of the people we talked about tonight: Frederick, Robert, Eton, and the others. They were ordinary people in ordinary situations just like us. Their stories are a reminder that every day is a gift, and every moment is a chance to be kind to the people we share this world with. I'll be back soon with more stories about the unexplained, the mysterious, and the dark side of human nature. Until then, keep your doors locked, your lights on, and your eyes open. You never know when the ordinary might take a turn, and it's always better to be prepared for the silence that follows. I'm glad you were here tonight. It makes the world feel a little less lonely when we share the weight of these mysteries together. Take care of yourselves and each other. The night is long, but the morning always comes eventually. We carry these echoes with us so that we can better appreciate the silence when it is peaceful and the noise when it is full of life. Thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering. It means more than you know. I'll see you in the next one, back in the places where the shadows are long and the stories are waiting to be told.